And now I'd like to introduce the leader of our first panel, Sean Murphy. He is a partner at Norton Rhodes Fulbright. He leads their blockchain practice. And at a time when most people in the legal profession are still grappling with what this technology means for their business and how it could impact their industry, he's been a pioneer. He's been creating world-leading research on the subject. He's been convening stakeholders around the world to come together and discuss these issues. And he's been advising clients on the cutting edge of what's been happening. And he's come here all the way from London, England, where he heads up this group, which is actually global in scope with people all over the world. And we're all very excited to have him here. So with that, Sean.
Hi, everyone. As Alex has probably said, my name is Sean Murphy. I'm a partner in Norton Rhodes Fulbright's London office, and I head our global distributed ledger and blockchain practice group. We're actually waiting for one of our panelists to get mic'd up. So I think just before I start, just to sort of scene set a little bit, as you know, what we're talking about now is smart contracts, and don't worry if any of you aren't familiar with the term. We will, at the beginning of this panel session, discuss what smart contracts are. I think for the moment, what I would say is that smart contracts are one of the most exciting topics in the blockchain and distributed ledger ecosystem at the moment. And if they live up to their potential, they have the possibility of radically transforming the way that we conduct business. And as a lawyer, I find that absolutely fascinating. It takes me right back to the fundamentals of contract law and raises some really interesting regulatory questions. We're very lucky to have a really distinguished panel of experts to talk about these issues with us. We've got Vitalik from Ethereum, we've got Yorke from Microsoft, Jeff from Bloq, and Jerry from IBM, and we'll be joined very shortly by Mark Smith from Symbiont as well. What I should say, actually, just an administrative point before we kick off. Although we don't have much time, we are going to try to cover an awful lot of ground in this, but we would like to leave a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. So if anybody would like to ask questions, could you come down to one of the two microphones at the front, and perhaps 5 or 10 minutes before the end of this session, we'll break and take a few questions from the floor. So what I'd like to do, as I said, start with a very simple question. I'll start with you, Vitalik. If you could introduce yourself and then explain what smart contracts are and how they work.
Sure. I'm Vitalik Buterin, founder of the Ethereum project. So the one-sentence definition that I've been starting to give for smart contracts recently is that a smart contract is a computer program that directly controls some kind of digital asset. So in general, if we think of a legal contract, it generally says something like, if some condition happens, then I promise to, let's say, transfer some amount of some currency to some particular person. And that contract would be signed between two parties, and it creates an obligation. The smart contract approach basically says, instead of doing that, you immediately transfer the asset into a program, and the program runs its code, and at some point it automatically evaluates the condition, and it automatically determines whether the asset should go to one person, whether it should go back to the other person, whether it should be refunded to the person who originally sent it, or whatever, some combination thereof. So the reason why people are interested is, and I'd say a few different areas. So one of them is that it offers the potential to just automate a whole bunch of things that before had to be done with paper and pen, had to be done through expensive legal processes and so forth. Sometimes, even as powerful as legal processes seem to be, they aren't all powerful. And the one specific case of governments not being all powerful that financial institutions often care about is the case where the guy that's supposed to pay the money ends up going bankrupt in the middle of the transaction. So that's counterparty risk, and that's a problem with traditional contracts. With smart contracts, not a problem at all. You send your asset into the program, and while it's in there, you don't own it, the program owns it.
Super. So, Mark, let me ask you a question. I mean, we have the word contract in the term smart contracts. To what extent is it possible to sort of fully codify a contract? Are we talking about the entire codification, or is it a partial codification of a contract?
So I'm Mark Smith, CEO of Symbiont. We're a smart contract. We actually call ourselves a smart security company because we're purpose-built to solve problems in traditional financial markets. It's our thesis that you model the full contract. We are in a hybrid world today where there are legal questions, I think, which we'll talk about. We've been talking about now for quite some time around what the real status is of a smart contract as it relates to liability, risk, and what consideration happens based on that contract. So in our structure, you model the full contract. You can even actually hash or upload a written version, right, with a wet signature to accompany the new programmable asset, which Vitalik just described. So we think it's important now to be able to model the full contract. Over time, we think that hybrid world will go away, and we'll be in a world where you can originate the contract as a smart contract and it can live its full life. We believe that legally and regulatorily that'll be accepted because it actually is a superior way from what we do today.
And how will the terms of the contract be validated? Because many of the parties who will be negotiating them may not be able to read the code language. How will they have assurance about the sort of the effect of the smart contract?
So again, because we've chosen to focus exclusively on financial markets, there are so many applications for smart contracts. It's very exciting what you could do with them. It's almost limitless. So you have to sort of put your blinders on and say, what are we going to be good at? And so we decided we wanted to be good at financial instruments. And so therefore, we've made choices in our technological structure that facilitate the utilization of these contracts in financial markets. So the first choice we made was to write our contracts in Python, a subset of Python called Python 3, because it's human readable. Which then allows for not only the assembly of the contract by a traditional market participant to literally just type in English words and numbers and create this new instrument, but also if there's a dispute amongst counterparties, you want to be able to look at the code, see what the code did based on the audit trail of the ledger, and determine whether or not, deterministic as we were talking about earlier, whether or not it did what it was supposed to do. So in that instance, right, we think it's extremely important that they're structured in that fashion for financial instruments to be able to allow for dispute resolution in a much faster, as well as when you enter into law where there is a little bit of resistance or regulation when there's resistance. When we speak to the SEC or the CFTC or FINRA, the first question is, well, do I need to go hire expert coders to tell me what these smart contracts are doing? And we can answer, no, you don't. You can simply have the proper cryptographic key to extract and view the real terms and conditions and read them in English, and therefore you can come to dispute resolution much more quickly.
Super. So I'd like to now move on to Jerry.
I think Vitalik.
Vitalik.
I guess one point that I wanted to kind of, slightly qualify that with is that I think a very large portion of contracts are not going to be the kind where two parties end up negotiating the entire Python from scratch. They're going to be fairly standardized. And I think, if this ends up taking off, we'll probably see some kind of sort of situation where, right now we have law firms creating standard form contracts. We'll probably have smart law firms creating standard form smart contracts, and, just about everything in between, from like filling out two fields on a form to, here's a piece of code, modify it.
Yeah, we actually have libraries.
It's going to be standardized across insurance, across auditors, across multiple industries. So not just law firms, but all of the sort of layers of the onion above that are also going to standardize across a template library, I would say, of smart contracts that are well studied, they're insured, they're understood by both law firms, programmers, and the average person.
Verifiable, validatable.
Absolutely.
I think it's also important to recognize that if you listen to this conversation, there's a foundational piece that we sort of forgot to mention, which is this is all possible today, right? If you take your very focused, we're talking about, a blockchain conference, right? But we have to remember that, the concept of these smart contracts, some of the value that they get is from the immutable ledger that is the underpinning of that. So it's a...
Yeah. Well, the way that I've described it is, they're not exactly the same thing. So theoretically, you can definitely have, a smart contract which is executed on top of us, backend server run by JP Morgan, and that's theoretically, if you trust JP Morgan, a completely legitimate thing to do, but it just so happens they have advantages that kind of complement each other.
So can we move on to talk about some of the use cases and applications for smart contracts? I think that will help people understand just quite how powerful this is. Jerry, do you want to sort of introduce yourself and then explain applications?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jerry Cuomo. I'm an IBM fellow and spent years at IBM working on middleware and transaction systems, and now I'm the vice president for blockchain technologies at IBM. And so use cases, love use cases. And the cool thing about smart contracts on blockchain is we really see it as a very broad set of use cases. Certainly financial services, but everywhere, logistics, things that start introducing Internet of Things, getting the physical world involved in the contract to help in dispute resolution. I mean, one of the use cases that it's a bit of a moonshot use case, but it starts to really bring some of the aspects of smart contracts along with the physical world is, how many of you out there have an autonomous vehicle or a self-parking vehicle, right? A few of you perhaps, think about new instruments around insurance. So if your self-parking vehicle crashes, who's liable, right? And, with smart contracts in a blockchain and maybe an oracle that could, detect who is actually in control of the car. Is it the driver through some sensors, or is it the car has shifted into automatic mode? If that can actually be issued on the ledger in a trusted and secure way, the insurance company can provide like temporal liability, right? And think about your car sitting in the driveway. It's a beautiful day, right? Weather company is working on, as part of the smart contract, and will put in the weather condition. Department of Motor Vehicle issues the roads are all been repaired in your area. Again, what's the liability now? Your car's sitting in the driveway, you're not using it. So you can think about the variety of applications, both for very traditional things, supply chain, logistics, trade settlement, but also things, contracts that we probably even haven't imagined to think about. And I love to talk about, bringing in the real world into it too.
So, Jeff, do you want to give some examples of the real-world applications? We'll come on to the sort of financial services sector in a moment, but the sort of supply chain type applications of this.
Sure. I'm Jeff Garzik, co-founder and CEO of Bloq. We're an enterprise blockchain and Bitcoin support company. One of my favorite real-world examples is very, very simple, a real estate purchase. You have in a typical buying a residential house example, you have obviously the buyer, the seller, and your real estate attorney. And people like to talk about disintermediation with blockchain and ledger and smart contracts where intermediaries will just go away. And I tend to think that it's more of a shift where, in specific terms, a simple smart contract is something called multi-sig, or a multi-signature transaction. And what a multi-sig contract is that, let's imagine that Mark, Jerry, and myself are all signatories in a 2 of 3 multi-sig contract. And what that means is that any 2 of the 3 people sitting on this couch can approve a value transfer. Now, how does that apply to real estate? Well, when you buy a house, you don't transfer the money directly from the buyer to the seller. What you do is you transfer the money to an escrow account, and then the real estate attorney who's handling the closing, goes through the English language contract, makes sure that all the contract clauses are satisfied, etc., and then they wire the money from the escrow account to the seller. Now, in sort of the smart contract world, the way that changes is that you send that value to a ledger, to a blockchain, and it has encoded in that value the conditions by which that value may be further spent. And so specifically in the real estate case, you have an escrow type situation where if the buyer and the seller agree, you actually don't need the real estate attorney at all. the buyer and the seller sign electronically, digitally, this contract, the value is transferred and the ownership of that residential property is transferred. But in the case of a dispute, then you would have a third party, that real estate attorney, functioning as an arbitrator type position. And that arbitrator would say, yes, I side with the seller, and so the value is transferred in that direction, or I side with the buyer and the value is transferred in the other direction. Now, what smart contracts do is they take that standard escrow type situation and they guarantee a very, very specific set of outcomes, whether it's the buyer gets their money back, the seller gets their money, who gets the house. That's very, very specific. There's never any confusion, and there's never any need for litigation. It's just simply a very limited computer-guaranteed set of outcomes. And so I think that real estate case is a fantastic, very simple, very easy to understand use case for the multi-signature type contracts. And once you have those basic type use cases, you can start to layer on more and more conditions that computers can execute. So, for example, supply chain, UPS can have smart contracts that say, if I receive cash on delivery at this location in a developing emerging market, then this other good, many links up the supply chain will trigger a supplier creating a new item, since the existing item was just delivered in that developing market. And so smart contracts have so many real world uses, and we're just starting to explore them.
Yeah, and Yorke, do you have thoughts on the sort of potential consumer use of smart contracts?
So my name is Yorke Rhodes. I work on a corporate team at Microsoft. I'm focused on blockchain strategy across the company and really looking at assets from the back office to the consumer-oriented products that you probably all use on your desktop today, whether it's Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel. So I think, to your point and your long soliloquy, right, it's a very deep rabbit hole, and you kind of have to really think hard about traditional use cases and unwind them and unwind the assumptions that you've made about those use cases to really, and it takes time, right? I mean, it's not something that you can do in 20 minutes. It's a room of people doing brainstorming, and facilitated discussions. And so that's what we're seeing actually a lot of this year as people look at the almost wrong assumptions or the legacy assumptions that they've made about products. So going towards the consumer side of this, we're really looking at how do we move up the value chain in terms of enabling the consumer to participate without necessarily having to know that they're participating, right? Because that's once you get to that point and you're like, well, I can do art tracking, right? I can do what we do today with RFID for clothing tracking from manufacturer to sale, right? If I can do that without having to think that blockchain or smart contracts are involved, then we've evolved as an industry to the point where consumers can now relate to it, and we can really start to think about it that way.
I'm going to give an example that's sort of a bit less institutional and quite a bit less sort of save the worldy, but it's actually very near term. So there already exist APIs on the internet where you can just automatically query them, and they tell you whether or not a particular flight got delayed, whether it got canceled, whether something else happened to it, and so forth. There's a service called Oraclize that lets you basically hook up any kind of API on the internet into the Ethereum blockchain. And so what you can do is you can take those two pieces, put them together with a smart contract, and create decentralized, completely automated peer-to-peer flight cancellation insurance. So,
that was my point.
Yeah, you can do that today. And you can do that today. Yeah.
Very good example.
Yeah.
So, Mark, I'd like to pull it back to the financial services sector. Can you give us a sense of the potential applications and uses of smart contracts in the financial services sector, and also what sort of time period over which we're going to really start to see them deployed in the financial services sector?
Yeah, so at the base of many financial instruments, they're just simple contracts, right? There are whole contract markets. The CME is a contract market. Like every single instrument there is a contract. In the simplest format for us, everybody's talking about syndicated loans. That's a very obvious use case, right? That's a loan contract, right? There are multiple parties to that contract. You have versioning and amendments. You need a ledger to track all that information. So you need both the power of the smart contract and the distributed ledger. We've modeled some really interesting things lately, like a catastrophe bond. So something that we learned about that, you use a weather oracle and you have an insurance product, and it's real world today, right? So it says, if this weather is X severe, then execute this insurance contract because there'll be X amount of damage. If it's not that severe, don't do anything. So that's happening now. People would be surprised. These aren't things that are going to happen in the next 5 or 6 years. These are things that are happening right now. We're in the final throes of deploying what will be our first corporate bond issuance. Corporate bonds are a really straightforward use case, right? There are terms and conditions, right? The corporation is offering to the consumers of that debt. They can be completely automated. There's no real need to have a middle and back office function of alerts and then chain of payments to pay a coupon payment. Smart contract, as Vitalik spoke earlier, you have an oracle. It's simply the atomic clock. It says, hey, on July the 1st, make these payments. It's just that simple. So these things are happening right now. And I think 2016 is the year of a lot of spotty use cases showing up in production. And then I think by the end of 2016 and 2017, this will start to become ubiquitous.
I think actually, sorry, Jerry.
No, I want to agree and also say that when you think about the adoption rate of smart contracts, like I started, I think we all talked about the moonshot ideas. These are things that will change profoundly everyday life. And that gets us all to the table and interested in the subject. But I have to agree that there are adoption patterns and there are business processes. There are business processes, let's face it, that have been in place for 30, 40 years that involve many diverse set of counterparties that are regulated, et cetera. Probably not, well, we probably should start thinking about those now, but they're not going to, those contracts aren't going to come into place anytime soon. But there are much more humble adoption patterns to start with. Compliance, contracts around ensuring compliance is something that you can almost build out these contracts intercompany, right? If you have a multinational company, these are things that won't necessarily require a vast set of lawyers, vast set of beyond your own corporate control. And I can see those patterns, those adoption patterns happening this calendar year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we'll see a lot of back office processes that are inside of a company orchestrated anew on blockchain with smart contracts. And we're seeing that now. And also across industry. So it's not just trade post-processing or compliance. We're seeing really interesting use cases in advertising. If you think about advertising, it's almost like a provenance problem, right? Because your brand is out there. Who's touching your brand? How are they touching it? Where is it getting touched? It's a really, really interesting use case that almost solves like the downstream affiliate marketing problem, right, that most brands have.
And I don't know who coined the term, but I heard it first from Arvind Krishna, who you'll be hearing from later, but the notion of a shadow contract or a shadow chain, which is you have a business process and it works today, but riding shotgun with it is a set of maybe blockchain-based contracts that are enriching the existing contract. So there's an enrichment chain, as a shadow chain, providing these ancillary functions, perhaps like dispute resolution, which is not indigenous to your existing business process. So pretty cool stuff.
And the compliance part of it is really interesting because we talk about the automation of action through smart contracts, but there's also the restriction of behavior as well, which is extremely important when you talk about compliance. Yeah. So when you look at modeling things like private equity, or you've got a vesting schedule, or you've got a 144, 144A, you've got a 365-day hold, you've got a ROFR from the company, right? So all those things are restrictions on what you're doing, not automation from the contract perspective. But they're very important because when you model those, now previous heavy liability use cases like private equity where you have to manage a paper certificate and then you have to keep a shareholder registry, a cap table, and then each different series has all these different restrictions. You have to manage all that. If you model it as a smart contract, now actually it opens up huge new business opportunities. And when you layer that onto something like Title III for crowdfunding or Reg A+, you've got a whole new industry where financial institutions previously have stayed away due to liability as well as compliance issues and high-touch kind of businesses. Now you can introduce this as a very low-touch automated business with very low risk.
And it's not just compliance, you got to think about auditing as well. Right. Once you have smart contracts that are machine executable, evaluatable by a computer, the auditors can also observe at a 50,000 foot level and have almost real-time auditing, not every quarter or every month, but every minute. Every transaction, you can have real-time risk assessment and real-time auditing, both internal and external, and smart contracts enable that as well.
And I think, going back to the advertising analogy, I think the shift to smart contracts is very similar to the shift in the advertising industry from manual ad placement to real-time bidding for ads. And that happened in literally a couple years.
Can I, Vitalik, can I ask you a question? I'm sure it's close to your heart. There's inevitably in conferences like this, there's a discussion between the relative merits of open, permissionless distributed ledgers versus private, closed distributed ledgers. Do you see, when we're talking about smart contracts, do you see there being sort of relative merits on either side when you're operating smart contracts on either of those?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first of all, I think there's definitely an entire spectrum. It's all the way going from, a private blockchain, which is basically just one node run by, one computer somewhere, to consortiums that have more open permissions, going all the way up to a public chain. So there's, a lot of choices there, and I think there is a bit of a false dichotomy that you have to kind of either choose the decentralized option or you have to choose, or the centralized option. Then, the way that I've been kind of describing it so far is that private chains generally have real efficiency advantages. So, Bitcoin can process 3 transactions a second, and that's not just because of Bitcoin. Like there are other blockchains that do a bit better, but not that much better. People want 1,000 to 100,000 transactions a second, and the fact is private blockchains actually can do that. So there's also just speed of execution. There is this concept of finality. There's just a guarantee that at some point transactions get to the point where they're confirmed and they won't be reverted. So private blockchains do provide all of those properties. I think also they're perceived as being kind of a safer initial way to go, just because they're still kind of controlled in the sense that people are used to. So to some degree, there are a lot of use cases that the public chain just doesn't work for at all. But where I see public chains really having benefits is basically synergy. So the idea is that if you have lots of different applications from lots of different industries, and you want to have a smart contract that says send 100 units of asset X inside of application Y, when some other event Z happens inside of application W, and you don't even need Z and W to even to talk to each other. That stuff can just happen on a public network automatically. That brings a lot of benefits in its own right. And I think there's kind of trade-off between them. I mean, potentially we could even see applications that involve public blockchains kind of talking to private blockchains in different ways.
Yeah, I think using an analogy for the layperson, I mean, no one ever asked the question, do we do the internet or the intranet, right? So it's very, very similar, right? I mean, they both make complete sense, right? And there's lots of different use cases where they interoperate, right? And then from a consortium's perspective, the early days of that was EDI, right? And intercompany communication through EDI, so.
Yeah, if I can add, I think we really haven't touched on a very important technological advancement is the ability to actually put the smart contract as a transaction on the blockchain. And I think that provides a lot of power, indigenous trust, and flexibility. And I think as you get into more permissioned blockchains, it enables a sense of confidential contracts. And I don't know that we've completely cracked all the computer science behind implementing a truly confidential contract. For example, unless we're using, for those computer scientists out there, homomorphic computing, which is we can actually execute a contract without decrypting it before it gets to the computer. the contract is actually going to have to execute in the clear on folks' computers. So that gives me a chance to see that in a supply chain, you got a better discount rate than I did if I happened to be executing it, right? So I think being able to provide a trust zone so that we can actually, in a more permission setting, to be able to execute contracts with privacy, as I said, unless Vitalik has them.
I have to seriously push back. I'm a pretty strong opponent of this concept that private blockchains are any good at all for privacy. And basically, the thing is that you have to ask yourself, why use a blockchain instead of a server? And the simple reason is, it's got the Byzantine fault tolerance. If you go up from having 1 computer to 10 computers, and all of a sudden your system works as long as, less than four of the individual computers break. But that's from the point of view of authenticity. From the point of view of privacy, if you go from 1 computer to 10 computers, all of a sudden you've gone up from 1 single point of failure to 10 single points of failure. You've gone up from just trusting JP Morgan with your data to trusting JP Morgan and Wells Fargo and RBC and UBS and HSBC.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I think there are several forms of trust that a permissioned blockchain will give you. We can debate about the computer science trust, but there's also the trust in the network, in the social network behind, the large retailer supply chain. There may be an existing legal binding system around that provides some level of trust. So when you enter the membership club, there's the computer science that's actually managing trust, but there's also the rules of membership and governance. So there may be an additional level of trust beyond just the computer science in a permissioned blockchain, if you would.
yeah, although on the other hand, I'd argue that I think people do also underestimate the extent to which you can use sort of legal levels of trust to give you very good guarantees of practical security on top of a public blockchain as well. So just to give one example, suppose you have trading some company shares on top of, some public blockchain, then the public blockchain gets 51% attacked, and that doesn't, but the thing is, you're dealing with an asset which is defined by the legal system, which is going to be interpreted by a court which is intelligent. You do not have to create, set up legal rules that say if the blockchain gets 51% attacked, that means that all trades, that happened in the last week actually revert. So you definitely can say, in the contract that defines, who owns the asset, if the blockchain gets attacked, and it's very reasonable to just leave a court to subjectively define the definition of an attack, then don't treat the blockchain as valid anymore, and then go into some other special process to figure things out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and I'll go back to less computer science oriented terms, although I would love to discuss that more with you. But I think explaining this to a financial institution or explaining it to a retailer or insurance company, I think there's the proof that we can actually do to prove that this contract is sound and trustworthy versus I'm a member of this network and I can sleep at night because at my level I understand it. So I think there's two levels of having a walled garden. It's the perceived trust and then the physical trust that you get out of that. So.
It's almost like the trust that retailers and others had to give to social media, right? And I can put my business in the clear, right?
Just before you hop off the topic, for us, it's really very clear. It's black and white. If it's a regulated instrument, it's very difficult to run it on an open source permissionless ledger because explain to regulators that there's an anonymous miner who's participating and getting paid for helping you with that transaction. That's a non-starter pretty much. So the way we view it is you need to be, as a smart contract company or a smart security company, neutral to the ledger layer, be able to participate on different types of ledgers, and then the instrument itself will dictate which is the appropriate ledger for that particular use case. And that's, for us, that's just as simple as it gets.
Okay, so we're very close to the break, but I'd like to just bring in, it looks like there are a couple of questions from the audience. So should we take a question from up here?
Hi, Victoria. I suppose Alan Hamilton. As we're in this government city, I feel like I should ask the question. So we're very interested at Booz Allen about how you can use smart contracts within a government setting for both smart permitting and then how this will affect regulation and also how government can use smart contracts itself. So I'd be interested to hear the panel talk about that idea, and is this, how are they conceptualizing the public sector use of smart contracts to manage relationships between public and private sector and within the public sector?
I think there's many examples. I mean, the utility space is one that's getting, energy and utility is getting a lot of play right now. Being able to put solar energy, from your home as a consumer back onto the grid, and utilizing smart contracts to do things that are very local, and providing the ability to essentially provide an energy exchange with a very local geography on a local microgrid. And that's happening around the world in different areas because it's very interesting. I think there's huge opportunities within the public sector, including voting, as an example, but that certainly is somewhere farther on the horizon. But if you look at the government internally as an organization that has to move a lot of paper and do a lot of internal consensus, it's a great platform for that.
Absolutely, and also with transparency, the public sector has to be transparent to its citizens, and blockchains and smart contracts actually enhance that in terms that not just the internal compliance units, the internal persons who are writing and participating in these contracts, but the public citizens themselves have an opportunity to have a greater opportunity to audit their government, have a greater opportunity to examine truly how money is moving through the government, how assets are moving from interagency, extra agency, et cetera. And that is just a whole new level of government in terms of trust, decentralizing trust, disintermediating trust, and building trust, greater levels of trust in your government by trusting it less. It sounds paradoxical, but that's essentially what this technology enables.
Okay, should we take a question from this side?
Hi, Josh Cincinnati from Bloq Cipher. I was just sort of curious because it seems independent of blockchains, smart contracts are all about replacing law with code, which, as long as developers are cheaper than lawyers, is pretty good business strategy. But what I'm wondering about is that ultimately, if you try to approach it from a hybrid blockchain model, you're going to have to execute that contract in a permissioned way, and it would probably require legal backing to ensure that participants don't either go above or below their sort of proof of work guarantees, at least because right now we don't have a viable proof of stake consensus model. So I'd be curious to hear what the panel thinks about, like, where would that savings exist in a permissioned blockchain case if you still have to have some sort of legal backing between it?
So first of all, just sort of quick Byzantine fault tolerance lesson.
Quick.
Okay, so basically, the reason why things like proof of work and proof of stake get invented is because they solve what's called the anti-Sybil problem. And the anti-Sybil problem basically is that if you have a system that has a whole bunch of, potentially anonymous actors participating, you have to find some way to prevent one guy from pretending to be a billion people and basically, saying, oh, look, I'm 99% of the network, I control everything. And the only way you prevent that is basically through economics, so by making it expensive to gain some level of participation in the system. So proof of work does that by requiring you to buy some amount of CPU power. The more CPU power you have, the more participation you have. Proof of stake, you kind of buy coins inside the system to get participation. It's kind of economically similar. In a private blockchain context, one of the reasons why private blockchains are technologically nicer in a lot of ways is because they don't have to deal with those economic questions at all. You have a private blockchain between 10 banks. You know who each of the banks are. You just give them all one vote. And there's a bunch of algorithms that people have been creating for the past 30 years that are specifically optimized for the case of achieving consensus when you have, 10 people and you know exactly who each of them are. So that part's not a problem. Now, the part about choosing who those 10 banks are, that's, is a challenge. Although I think with a lot of these systems, people are kind of hoping that sort of the legal work gets done once and then everyone else can kind of piggyback on top of it.
And I'd also make the quick point going back to my real estate example where you have your buyer, your seller, and traditionally your real estate attorney. With blockchain, it doesn't actually mean that that attorney goes away. It just boils that role down to the point of an arbitration. Is the buyer or the seller the right one from that directionality point of view? And so blockchain, it does disintermediate trust, but it's not sort of a magic bullet that means that lawyers go away. They're still functionally, yeah, exactly. So functionally, it's going to change the landscape, but it's not going to mean that magically lawyers go away. It's just more of a boiling down to the nuance.
And they're going to be starting writing code.
Yeah.
Lawyers are starting to write code. There's already several different schools that have a combination law and computer science track for this exact purpose.
And I took in your question a sense of compatibility of the contracts with the underpinning environments. And if that's the case, you heard earlier folks talking about templates and things like that, that there are cookie cutter templates, just like in libraries of them, which could get genned into whatever the local execution environment is. So I think from that perspective, compatibility across systems, I think is a key.
LegalZoom could be turned into a smart contract system.
It could
That's
be.
A library.
Well, or someone else out there could be already building one of those.
There's a law firm called Robot & Robot in Sunnyvale, California. All they do is smart contracts.
Also, while we're on the topic of kind of moving from the law versus code to talking about law and code, one of the interesting kind of projects I saw out of Singapore is this sort of concept of partially smart contracts. So the idea is you have some contract where most of the clauses are completely automatically executed, no one has any ability to intervene, but there are a few corner cases, and in those corner cases, the smart contract code itself basically says, this guy over here is the judge and he figures it out.
Okay, I'm conscious that we've run into the coffee break, so unfortunately we can't take any more questions, but the panel will be down here. So please, if you have questions, feel free to come down.
Thanks.